Hello and welcome to the technical breakdown for my dissertation project, Manu-Scriptwriter. So Manu-Scriptwriter is an interpreted narrative scripting language written in C#. Let me grab this. So what it will do is it will take in a text file and it will run it through this sort of compiler, which will scan it for a set of tokens. Then it will parse that into a set of statements, and then when that set of statements is passed into the interpreter, what it will do is it will actually run the code, it will register all the events, it will handle cleaning up the script, and so on. So this language has some simple language support, it has simple variable definition, it has a couple of conditionals, so while and for loops. I didn't particularly use this within testing just because I didn't want to confuse the writers too much, and I don't think I found a particularly good solution for handling those in a way that was human readable. So for now, I've just sort of kept that aside and focused on the main part of the language, and that main part are the functions and the events. So these aren't defined within the narrative scripting language, within text files for that. Instead, they're defined in separate C-sharp sort of libraries, which are just instances of a certain class, and that class will have different functions and events that are marked up with these attributes for events and functions respectively. So here we've got a Manu-Scriptwriter event, which is the input event. This is for the console version of this project. And when it comes across anything structured like this, it will register that as an event. And here we go. So we've got when the player talks to NPC, for instance. Then when is its own keyword, which denotes an event. The player is the first input at 0, and NPC would be the second one. This is a slightly different format because it's used for the Unity side of things, which I'll discuss in a bit. So what happens here is these are the inputs and they're taken out using regex. For events, whenever it comes across an event, a sentence that has the inputs already, it will check that it has a saved block and it will run that block if these inputs match. So it uses a sort of broadcasting event rather than narrowcasting as would be the most efficient. So then there's run dialog here. So run dialog is fairly similar. So these would be the inputs. They're converted into the inputs here, and context is always passed in. This just contains some simple helper functions for pausing pausing the interpreter and things like that. So it will take this, and for the console version, it will just rewrite the line to say name, says, and then the line. And then it will wait for this console event, which in this I've made run only after doing a read line. So this is it's a relatively naive console implementation just for testing purposes. I wanted to keep it in a separate project just so that it could be easier ported to other engines and things like that. Things that are of note of this is that this currently only works with strings, so you can't pass in tokens to an event or a function or identifiers even, so you can't have integers or anything like that. You'd have to convert it from the string, which I think that would be a good thing to improve if I worked on this a lot. If I work on this further, then so this was developed as a plugin for Unity, which I put here. So you just put in the built version, and that works fine. For the plugin, here we've got this storyteller. The storyteller script is what handles the interpreter and calling the different functionality. So what it will do is it will find any object that has an action script, and it will compile that and interpret that. It will set up all the events ready for the scene itself to actually run. Then the Unity version of the events have their own library here. So we've got when the player talks to NPC as before, so you can do the different text, you can do camera stuff, you can do this thing with the emotions here, the X feels Y, and of course you can do dialogue. Something you'll notice here, which I didn't quite show off in the console version of this, is you can have multiple events or multiple functions attached to a single uh, multiple attributes attached to a single event or function, and this is so that you can account for various different ways of specifying that something has happened. So, for instance, the player speaks with cat doesn't make as much sense as the player interacts with the cat. It's that sort of thing. But I do feel like it takes up quite a lot of space. There's a lot of duplication here. I wonder if there's a way to make it a little bit more succinct from the technical perspective, and possibly by tying different functions to verbs or something like that. But at the moment, this worked fine. Um, the only problem that this really had was particularly for the functions. It forces you to use capitals and it forces you to use full stops. Grammar just in general, if it's missing even the smallest thing, or if it's got maybe one too many spaces, then it kind of goes wrong. That was something that the testers brought up as an issue, or a couple testers had issues with the grammatical requirements. They thought it was a bit too strict. So I think it would be interesting to try and develop this so that you don't necessarily need that, even if it is uh, probably a little bit more professional if you do force the punctuation and the grammar, but it does make it a little bit less uh, friendly for people that have any sort of writing difficulties for any reason. So there are a couple different ways that this could be improved just in general. So for one, I believe I already mentioned this, so Manu-Scriptwriter is a interpreted language, so it will compile and interpret it on runtime. I think it would be better to have it be compiled rather than interpreted. I feel like this would make it a lot faster, possibly even investigating use of C++. I know that will be kind of interesting to do given that it doesn't have any sort of reflection built in, but that's something to play around with. Another thing is the as mentioned, the grammatical requirement. I would like to see if there's a way to reduce the amount of grammar that's necessary, if there's a way to simplify things a little bit more or make it easier. Alternatively, I want to make it easier to debug this sort of thing, so I want there to be an easier way to spell check, an easier way to get the right information out of the debugging statements, because at the moment they'll say a specific line, but the writers had a bit of trouble, the ones that had issues. They mentioned having a bit of trouble trying to jump in and find those errors in places. So another way that I could fix that, if not by changing up some of the debug errors, would be to make a plugin for a code editor such as Visual Studio, or maybe giving the option to edit in Unity, whichever way is easier. And then this way I could possibly make it so that it's a bit so that the different options are a bit more restricted. You know what you can write as opposed to what you'd like to write, I suppose, and things like that. Other options would be reloading scripts on runtime. So at the moment, if you press play and then you edit something while it's in play mode, it doesn't automatically reload, and there's no way to do that without completely restarting a scene. So I think that adding some kind of just debugging key for that would definitely help in the long run. And then the other thing is just more functionality in general for the framework. So at the moment, it's got a couple dialogue options, it's got a couple camera options, but it's not amazingly complex, and there's no branching dialogue either because of the conditionals not being quite finished. So that would definitely make this a lot more powerful of a tool for writers to use if it becomes more of a not necessarily commercial, but possibly open source, a publicly available tool. So yeah, that's a technical breakdown for Manu-Scriptwriter. Thank you for listening.